Japan, the real estate market. This was in the 80s, I think, and as it pertained to it being used as collateral for international flows, and how you came to that conclusion when this was a very serious mystery for everyone else.
Yes, yeah. Well, let's talk about that. The capital flows, and of course, I mean that's always a current story.
And you can also mix in the Japanese truth telling here that you talked about last night, which I thought was very fascinating.
Well, I learned a lot. I learned most of the things in my 12 years in Japan. Initially, as a student, in Japan they have this idea that there's two truths. The official truth, and in any official meeting, it's only going to be the official truth, which everyone knows is not true, and the real truth. And the real truth, you're allowed to speak after hours, after sort of 6-7 o'clock. It's off the record, and that's when everyone talks straight, the real truth. But you're not supposed to quote people and say, "Oh, he said that and that." It's supposed to be off the record. And because Japan is very formalistic, there's a lot of that official truth. So people get very tired. So they're quite keen to actually, let's meet tonight. Let's talk straight, about this. It's too tiring to always be in this fictional world of official truth. And as a result, I mean, they're quite keen to tell you the real truth. That's how you learn about everything, including how central banks really work. The central bank has told me, off the record, the real truth. The banks, how the bankers do it, and all the tricks of the trade. Now, I was a student. I had this position at the Development Bank of Japan, and I had to choose a topic. And of course, at the time, this is the late 80s, end of the 1980s, Japanese capital flows were a big puzzle. Japanese money seemed to be conquering the world, but where was it coming from, and why so much money? Because it was more money than all the economic theories expected, and it was against the interest rate differentials, which usually are the main variable in the standard models. So it was a puzzle. My proposition was it's probably somehow connected to the other puzzle, which is this real estate boom. People didn't call it a bubble at the time. That's only afterwards you call it a bubble once it's burst, right? At the time, it's an asset price rise that's justified by XYZ usually, or productivity gains and all sorts of reasons, why this is justified. But it was extraordinary, the little plot of real estate in central Tokyo connected to the Imperial Palace Garden, which is not that large. I mean, it's decent, but had the same market value as the entire state of California, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, you name it.
Crazy.
Which is completely crazy. I mean, but to me, it seemed that if you have that sort of relationship, surely many Japanese landowners want to just own a little bit of foreign land because, just for diversification, because you get much more out for your money abroad.
You have a massive unrealized gain in your position. You might as well diversify.
Exactly. And so somehow I thought there's a link, but as a student, I was looking for papers or models, theories that were linking real estate and capital flows. There was nothing until somebody pointed out, there's this paper by Jeffrey Sachs. He was in Japan with his, I think, PhD student Peter Boone, and they wrote a paper at MITI about it, Ministry of International Trade and Industry. So I went there to the ministry and asked around. And we had these Americans here, Professor Sachs, yes. And they showed me here's the discussion paper from MITI. And I thought, great, I don't need to reinvent the wheel. And these are famous, Jeffrey Sachs, famous economist. I'm just a student. And so that's fine. I'll just have a slightly different version of the same model. I'll quote him. That's fine. So initially, same idea of land bubble, capital flows, extraordinary. Nobody can explain both. Surely there's a link. So then they do the analysis. Conclusion, there is no link. And why not? Well, the logic was, how did the Japanese cash in on this enormous real estate bubble in time? And they did invest abroad. So how do they cash in to then buy foreign assets? Well, you've got to sell the land But to who? Foreigners weren't buying it because it's so ludicrously expensive. No foreigner would buy Japanese land. That's true. So then it's other Japanese buying it. But if other Japanese buying it, the money stays in Japan. Therefore, there's no link, was their conclusion. And I realized, after some divine intervention, that actually that's wrong. That's not how it works. The story is, of course, when we're talking big money, one way or another, banks are likely to be involved. And so the story is, you don't sell the land. The land is used as collateral, and the banks are creating new credit, which is new money on the back of it. And some of it spills over abroad as capital flows. And so once I'd realized that, then I looked for the data.
This was a real mystery at the time, as you're saying.
Completely.
Like people were saying, don't look into it. It's not worth it. No one can figure it out.
All the experts had told me, this is impossible. This puzzle can't be solved. You know, all the capital flow experts and financial market experts, and Jeffrey Sachs saying the opposite. So here I was, you know, a student who could solve the puzzle. It's still the only paper published in the Review of International Economics, 1994. Japanese asset prices, Japanese capital flows and the asset price bubble, something like that is the title. It's the only model to explain the huge surge in capital flows, but also what followed, which was a complete collapse in capital flows. And so, of course, that also couldn't be explained with standard models, but in my model, worked very well because the driving variable is bank credit for real estate purchases. And that collapsed first, and then also from the 1990s onwards, capital flows collapsed, and actually Japan became a net importer of capital. So it all goes back to bank credit, and I realized, wow, this is such a powerful variable. Surely many other things can be explained by it, and I did some tests, and I could explain, if you disaggregated, as I had done, credit for the real economy, excluding these real estate and asset credits, then explains GDP very well. And velocity doesn't decline, it's stable. So I could explain GDP growth, capital flows, and if you then look at the credit for asset transactions for real estate, I could explain asset prices very well. That's the model I've been using ever since, and it works. Now, I then developed a policy recommendation out of this, because also I realized, wow, this huge asset bubble that happened in the 80s, it's a bubble, and it's now beginning to crumble. This is going to be a banking crisis. So I was one of the first ones to point out, because you have to remember, in 1991, when I wrote this, the top 20 banks in the world were all Japanese.
Right. Yes. People thought Japan was taking over the world at this time.
Japanese money was going to buy up the world. The Japanese century, the 21st century is going to be the Japanese century.
And this is really just a giant credit bubble blown.
So my conclusion of this paper was published as an Oxford discussion paper back at Oxford in 91. Was the great yen illusion, I called it, was that Japanese banks were likely to go bankrupt, and Japan was likely to move into the biggest recession since the Great Depression. And I've been using, my entire career has been built on credit creation analysis. I then became chief economist at a British investment bank. I was quickly a top, in the top three, first number 3, then later number 1 economist on Japan. Using my credit model, I could explain economic growth, which previously had been pretty difficult for people to forecast and explain what's happening in Japan. Became very, very clear, and the data is very good in Japan if you know what you're doing. And of course, I then could also apply to many other things. To analyze history, you get a completely different view. History has to be rewritten with the understanding of who is creating the money supply and who's buying those politicians. Otherwise, historians just study the front men. Okay, here's Caesar, here's Napoleon, here's Adolf Hitler, whatever. Well, why are they in power? Who's funded their rise?
Right.
Who's backing it? Follow the money.
Look at find the truth. Yeah.
And you find out. And of course, particularly the First World War, Second World War, the games played by the central bankers is just really shocking. I hope we'll have another opportunity to talk about that.
Yes, no,
But what I'd like to still draw out of this and explain is coming back to one of the points you mentioned is quantitative easing. So I realized Japan was going to go into the biggest recession since the Great Depression, but I also realized it's unnecessary. We can quickly come out of this if you take the right steps. And that's what I then published in the Nikkei, the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, as a policy recommendation, which I called quantitative easing, a new monetary policy. I called quantitative easing. Until then, the concept hadn't been used, which is to expand. I mean, basically, the audience now knows the answers. What do you need? You need credit creation for productive business investment. But your banks are now bust after all this, after the bubble, after the bad policies and credit for the wrong things, for asset purchases. Well, it's just a numerical problem, right? It's an accounting problem. We don't need to have a recession and unemployment for an accounting problem, right? So how can we make the bank balance sheets good again? The problem is the banks thought they had 100 assets. Now it's only 20 because 80 is non-performing. So no problem. So my first advice was QE1, the first version of QE, to heal the banking system balance sheets. The central bank buys the non-performing assets at face value. So the central bank buys them at 100. The banks now have 100. And, it's cash. I mean, there's the strongest balance sheet, the highest liquidity ever. So the banking system is fine. You may say, hang on, aren't you just shifting the problem to the central bank? No, because...
Well, no, you're shifting it to the taxpayer ultimately through inflation.
Well, no, there is actually no cost. This is the shocking thing. There's no cost. It's a free lunch if you want.
If the lending is done productively, which is a big
henceforth, but that's the future. You see, we're talking about the past problem.
My question would be this: wouldn't I hear what you're saying? If the lending is done productively, then it does heal.
But that's
the
next step.
system.
We're just talking about this cleaning the bank balance sheets.
Okay, well then maybe it's the second question. But wouldn't the decentralized free banking model be the best way to actually do that rather than?
I'm all for decentralized banking. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course you're talking about how to avoid this in the first place. Yeah. And yes, there's
right.
You have to make sure there's competition between banks, many small banks. Basically, a free banking system is a good way of dealing with this.
Right.
You could have some regulation, but within limits. Banking is totally overregulated. There's no doubt, and it's the wrong regulation. So we still have banking crises, and there will be another one. The next one is in Germany in the next 2-3 years. A massive banking crisis taking down all the banks. It's always the same game. The ECB has now done. Again, what the Bank of Japan had done first, because the bubble of the 1980s in Japan was created. Why did we have these land prices? It was the banks creating credit for asset purchases, driving up those land prices.
Right.
It was totally artificially created. But why? I researched looking for the smoking gun. Why were the banks doing this? I asked the loan officers, and that were actually loan officers in the 1980s, and they were literally giving out those loans, and they told me, we're looking back at the edge, crazy days. I was giving out these loans for companies that weren't even our customers. I cold called them, said, here's the real estate, I've done the calculation, you just sign, we give you the money, it'll go up, you'll make money, we make money. That's how aggressively they're pushing these real estate loans. And they would say things like, wow, this is really dangerous. I think we're creating a bubble there.
This sounds a lot like 2007.
Yeah, exactly. It's always the same game. Yeah. So why did you do it? I had to do it. I was given orders. I was given instructions. By who? By the branch manager. Next, I interviewed the branch managers. And the branch manager said, crazy days in the 80s. I was telling my loan officers to increase bank credit for real estate transactions massively. We're probably creating a bubble there. It was pretty risky. Well, why were you doing it? Well, I was just following orders. Headquarters were telling me, strategic planning department at the bank. Next, I went to the strategic planning department of some of the big banks. At the time, I was visiting research at the Bank of Japan, so I had a Bank of Japan name card. It was easy to arrange these meetings. So, Bank of Japan, okay, certainly. And some also I met then for dinner where they were speaking the truth. But anyway, it was because I had the Bank of Japan card, they felt they could actually say what happened because it was a Bank of Japan story, as it turns out. So the strategic planning department told me, Oh, crazy days in the 80s. We were telling our branch managers to increase real estate lending like crazy. We're probably creating an asset bubble there. And you know, it's probably quite risky what we did. So why did you do it? We're just following orders. By who? Maybe the CEO of the bank? No, it was the Bank of Japan. It was the window guidance. And the key guys at the Bank of Japan, the key guy deciding this was somebody called Fukui. And they told me, by the way, this Fukui, he was doing this in the 80s. He's known as the Prince. Why the Prince? And they use the English word. I mean, the whole thing is Japanese, but suddenly Prinsu in English, you know, Prinsu desu. Why is he the Prince? Because he's been selected as future governor. He'll be governor of the Bank of Japan. And these key guys, the princes of the yen, the name of my book, which you can get at quantumpublishers.com. This... And the full story with all the evidence and their eyewitness accounts by the central bankers when they were quite willing to speak about this, because I did this research in the early 90s when nobody realized this is going to really blow up big way. And so these princes were selected so early on because it was basically, this is how you run a cartel. This is how you run organized crime. It's about loyalty. They were selected 30 years before they became governor as future governor. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, there's quite a few stories surrounding that, but just to stick to this now. So the asset bubble of the 80s was created on purpose by the Bank of Japan is one of the major conclusions of my book, Princes of the Yen, which I proved with the eyewitness accounts, but also with the data, econometric analysis, and it's undisputed. Of course, it became a bestseller in Japan, number one bestseller, ahead of Harry Potter for 6 weeks. Wow. Because it was revealing the truth, how the Bank of Japan on purpose created this mess, the asset bubble, and then the crisis and recession, which is only, was still in full swing by 2001 when the book came out. And so central banks are really very much in charge. That's what you realize, you know, they're the ones that cause these problems. So the ECB has done the same in Germany, created an asset bubble by forcing the banks to increase real estate lending from 2009 to 2022. Massive expansion in real estate lending, real estate bubble in Germany. They then bursted by suddenly raising rates in 22. And the rest is going to pan out now slowly. It's going to be history. This asset bubble is going to burst. It's going to take the banking system with it. Why? Well, I learned already in 1989 from a banker. I was an intern at a bank, and this banker I was interning with had just come back from a lunch at the Bank of Japan. And he said, Richard, you know what I heard of at lunch? 1989, top 20 banks, all Japanese in the world. The Bank of Japan wants to reduce the number of the big banks. They were called city banks, big sort of money center banks. Consolidation. And there were more than 20, I think 23 or so. They want to reduce the number of banks from the current, 23 or so to 3. What? How's this going to happen? Well, they've achieved it.
Same pattern.
You create an asset bubble, you create a crisis. And of course, the long recession, as I show in my book, Princes of the Yen, also had the other purpose of breaking this system, which was too egalitarian for the likings of these central planners. It was a very successful system, giving a lot of wealth creation to everyone. Right. To the ordinary Japanese people, and they don't like that. And the idea was to break that system with a 20-year recession, which is what the central planners organized in Japan. But you can get, and really the proof is in that you could have got out of it any time using QE. So QE1 is for the central bank to purchase the non-performing assets from the banks. The banks are now whole. It's not a cost to society or to the central bank, because it's not money creation. It's money creation is when the banking system creates money and is injected into the non-bank sector. This doesn't happen here. It's an interbank transaction between the central bank and the banks. There's no money creation. So it also can't lead to inflation, and it doesn't. This is what the Fed did in 2008, by the way. Bernanke was listening to my proposal. And when he became chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, that's what he did, QE1 in 2008. So
because they recapitalized the banks directly and didn't do helicopter money, it did not create inflation.
Exactly. And that's what confused a lot of people. They thought, wow, this...
But it did create a lot of asset inflation.
Of course, asset inflation. Because, you then have banks, and this is the next step. you can lend, but what for? And then you're always back to the three possibilities. If it's for assets, you get asset inflation. If it's for consumer credit, you get inflation. If it's for productive business investment, you get growth without inflation. But that's not what they aimed at. So you have to blame the central planners again. They're the ones that see the big figures, the aggregate figures, and they can make sure the incentives are right to get the right result. But they usually want different results. Now, I was convinced that even if you did that in Japan, because the bubble was so big and the pain was going to be so big, everyone realized our bank is bust. The bankers, even if you clean up that through central bank purchases, they will still not lend. So you'll still get a credit crunch for a few years. And I came up with a proposal I call QE2, the second version of QE, in which the central bank can force credit creation through the banking system. Namely, the central bank buys assets from the non-bank sector. When this happens, this is unusual because normally a central bank only deals with banks. But if it buys assets from the non-bank sector, the banks are forced to create the money for it. My proposal was, because Tokyo is a very dense city, it's a great city, but it doesn't have many park areas and park service. But it's some beautiful parks, but in terms of compared to other big cities, it's very modest. Well, get the Bank of Japan to buy real estate because there's going to be a huge real estate slump, and turn it into parks. That's all you need. You will force the banks to create money this way because this is non-bank purchases. As the central bank now instructs the sellers of the land, their banks, we're paying money.
Right.
The banks get reserves on the asset side, and they have to credit on the liability side the deposit accounts of the seller. This is money creation.
Right.
This is how a central bank can force money creation. They didn't do it. They claimed, we can't do this. Well, how come in March 2020 they could do it? This is what all the central banks did in March 2020.
Gotcha.
This is what the Fed did, and the figures were astonishing. Massive, massive purchases of assets from the non-bank sector, forcing the banks to create enormous money, unprecedented in Fed history. And that created, 18 months later, this double-digit inflation.
Right. That plus the helicopter money. So you got asset inflation and consumer price inflation.
Well, they made sure that it was used for consumption because of all these programs. Stimulus checks and various programs encouraging people to, essentially, business were encouraged to be unproductive by shutting down supply chains. And then encouraging people to spend. Well,
what do you think?
You're going to get inflation.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.